My name is Joyce. I'm the director of content development for Wolfram Alpha. So I oversee a lot of the pipeline for ingesting real world knowledge into the Wolfram knowledge base and how that gets shown through Wolfram Alpha, through the Wolfram language, entity value, and other functions. And also now, of course, through our various APIs, the way it shows up in the Wolfram GPT. Um, so this talk is really just focused on the Wolfram custom GPT available for ChatGPT. Um, it's going to be a fairly high level overview of what it can do, a little bit about what's happening under the hood. So looking at some of the APIs that are actually being called, how prompting works, some tips about using it more effectively for different purposes you might get into. And certainly the rest of the week, there are going to be lots of more talks where people will take you through some of the much more powerful things you can do in chat notebooks and other things directly in Wolfram language notebooks. I can see that some questions are coming in already. I'm going to try to focus just on going through my presentation, and then I think we'll have plenty of time to circle back um, and try to cover people's questions as they come up and anything else that might remain when we get to the end. Um, the Wolfram GPT. This is really an evolution of the Wolfram plugin for ChatGPT, and I saw somebody asking, I think, on the chat about whether the plugin still exists. I can't remember the exact timeline, but OpenAI had announced earlier this year that they were going to phase out plugins because they viewed the custom GPTs as a more powerful evolution of that technology. So I think the plugins may still be accessible to people who've used them, but at some point those are going to be unavailable. So really the main way, if you want to um, if you're using ChatGPT through their web interface, the Wolfram GPT is really the primary way to get access to Wolfram Alpha and Wolfram language capabilities within the ChatGPT environment. So this has taken advantage of a lot of developments we've made on our side over the last year or so, both in the way that we understand how to effectively prompt LLMs to make calls to Wolfram Alpha, how to write Wolfram language code, but also in the developments we've made in our APIs, coming up with both Wolfram Alpha and Wolfram language APIs that are designed really to be called by LLMs and not people, which was an interesting concept when that first came up, that we were going to have APIs that, for the most part, we didn't expect humans to interact with. But if you want to access the Wolfram GPT, certainly you need to have a ChatGPT Plus account. You can go into the GPT store. Lately, we've been hovering near the top of the list in the research and analysis category, or you can just search for Wolfram and we'll pop up. We've had a lot of people having conversations with GPT, which is really good to see, and generally people are having good experiences with that. Um, so when you're using it, certainly you can, if you're familiar with Wolfram language and Wolfram Alpha, um, you can do all the same kinds of basic things that you can ask Wolfram Alpha for, or you can have simple requests that the GPT will try to turn into Wolfram language code. So for something like this, I'm saying plot sine of x squared. In this chat, it happened to choose to try to write the Wolfram language code for that, which is very compact. It gets back a pointer to an image of the result, and it can show that. In another chat, it's because it's certainly non-deterministic, you might by default get a call to Wolfram Alpha. Um, the prompt that we have for the GPT tries to encourage it for simple kinds of queries, certainly for things that have to do with uh, real world data, um, with very simple kinds of plotting things, that it would default to Wolfram Alpha because it tends to be a little bit quicker to formulate the natural language input and just make that call to Alpha and get the result. But it could be Wolfram language, it could be Wolfram Alpha. You'll see in the calls here, if it's making a Wolfram language call, it's going to be going to the chatgpt.wolfram cloud endpoint, which is where we're hosting the Wolfram language API. If it says it talked to wolframalpha.com, then it's just making a natural language call to Wolfram Alpha. If you click on these, you can see what was actually sent to the API. So in this case, it sent what you would send in a normal natural language input to Wolfram Alpha. In the other call, you can see the actual code that was sent through that API. And certainly the one of the main differences here, and something to think about if you're trying to steer a chat one way or another, if it's writing Wolfram language code, then all you're going to get is whatever that code evaluates to. If it's Wolfram Alpha, then certainly you get, um, like you normally get with any kind of Wolfram Alpha result, other kinds of context, additional pods that might give some more useful information to the LLM, which is one of the nice things about having Wolfram Alpha plugged in here. Um, Now, other kinds of things you can do, certainly ChatGPT 4 has its own code assistant functionality built in. It can write Python code and evaluate that in its own environment. It can do a lot of things very well. I mean, we see again and again lots of things where it does not do things terribly well. I mean, this is a relatively straightforward query. um, it writes a lot of Python code. It gets all the right packages and libraries, and gives you something that is not particularly helpful. Um, Conversely, using the Wolfram plugin, this is trying to solve the same problem. Writes one line of Wolfram language code, sends that to the API, gets an image of that plot back, and then you can even build on that. And that's one of the great things I think about using the GPT is you say, well, that's good, but can you refine this? Can you change that? And you can say, well, I only want to see the intersection of those. Modify the code, and you get just the region where those two conditions intersect. Um, Other kinds of things that you have access to, certainly because we've got Wolfram Alpha plugged into this, um, you have access to a lot of current data and the ability to compute with current data that is more recent than whatever the training cutoff was for the model. That's currently the latest thing that ChatGPT is using. So asking for things like when's the next solar eclipse visible? Makes a call to Wolfram Alpha, gets all of the relevant data for that. If there are images, it'll pull those in. It can show those in the result, and then link out to the Wolfram Alpha website, and you can kind of see, it's got access to all of this kind of data, and it's able to take that and synthesize, a very helpful kind of result. And then you could ask more questions about this if you wanted to know, ask more questions about the maximum or when it ends. You could continue this conversation, and it'll keep going with that. The other thing that I found, really exciting about having uh, connections between LLMs and Wolfram technology, whether it's here or in our own chat books, is just the ability to have conversations really and keep building on queries, not have to be constrained to what we have in Wolfram Alpha on the website, which is certainly basically a one-shot thing. You ask a natural language query, you get a result, but then you can't really continue on from that question. You have to form a new question. You can't just say, refer to things like then or that day. So this is something just what date was some number of days ago. It calls Wolfram Alpha. You get lots of information. Okay, what was the population of the UK then? Then it's going to make a call and ask about that particular year. It's going to give you some more context for that. Um, you could refer to that specific day and ask for something like when Venus rose, and they can do this kind of computation. A lot of things that ChatGPT by default would not be able to do anything like this with any precision. So that's very exciting to be able to build on those things. Um, and certainly more complicated kinds of queries. So, here is, I think I borrowed this example from my colleague Michael Trott. Um, you know, Trying to
Alan,
find, yeah, of course,
sorry. Would it be possible to magnify the
a little
web
bit more.
Yes, please. Thank you. That's great.
Is
Thank you
that
so
better?
much.
Yeah, no, of
Yes.
course. Finding probabilities of the sums of points on three six-sided dice. Um, Now, in the core prompt for the Wolfram GPT, we've tried to encourage a chain of thought approach. We've we're telling the model whenever you have some kind of query that requires more complex computation, try to articulate the problem, lay out the steps you're going to use to follow it, explain the specific Wolfram language tools that you're going to use, and then try to implement those. And so this is a kind of a good demonstration of that. It's saying, this is the problem, this is how we need to compute it. Um, this is specifically the functions that we're going to use in the Wolfram language to do that. And then it'll write that code and send it off to the API and give you a nicely formatted summary of the results. Um, it won't always show the code by default, but all you really have to do anytime that there's been a call to the Wolfram Cloud is just say, "Can you show me the code?" And it'll pop that up in a nice box that you can copy. And if you're using a cloud notebook, you're using desktop notebook, you can copy and paste that, and then evaluate that, build on it, use that for whatever kind of project you're working on. Um, you can certainly ask it to show you the code and incorporate comments. If you want to do that, we could get a version of this that has comments explaining each step in here. But this is a nice kind of summary of what's happening in those stages. Um, and again, both here and in our own chat notebooks, that's been a great thing to have uh, kind of a programming partner that can explain code to you and help you get better at finding problems or just understanding what's happening. Um, some other things that I really wanted to point out in interacting with the Wolfram GPT, language is really important. Word choice can influence things in sometimes subtle, sometimes very dramatic ways. So if you have an input that's something like this, which is essentially a command, you're just saying 3D plot the gamma function here. Um, in this case, this kind of seems to bypass that core instruction to use a chain of thought approach, and it really jumps right in. It writes code, it sends it, it evaluates it, it shows it to you. This isn't a particularly helpful view. If instead you said something as simple as "show me how to make a 3D plot," just adding a few words there, what you get then is, okay, this is how you would do it. I'm going to explain sort of the concepts behind it. I'm going to lay out a plan for writing the code and then showing all the code and then evaluating it. Um, the other thing that I will note, and anybody who's familiar with Wolfram language, you probably know this already. Uh, ChatGPT and by extension the Wolfram GPT often will. I'm not sure what to say. It overwrites code to some degree. It likes to specify plot themes and color functions and plot ranges. To some degree, I think this is sort of picking up on idioms that are required in a lot of other languages. If you're going to plot something where you need to really specify a plot range, you need to specify a color scheme. Um, and so what this means is that sometimes the code that gets written by ChatGPT, if it was just even a little bit simpler, you'd get a better result. So this was a case where I was saying, it's specifying a plot range that kind of hides sort of the interesting things that are going on in this plot. Um, so I said, well, let's remove the plot range and color function, and it'll go back, rewrite that code, and then the Wolfram language by default um, uh, crops that plot to a more interesting view of what's happening in that function. And then I kind of realized, well, the color function was kind of useful, so let's add that back in. Color function goes back in, and you get a plot that's a much more, I think, useful visualization of what we're talking about here. So just something to keep in mind in general that we keep trying to encourage the LLM to not overdo things, to not always specify some of these options. We've included some of that in the prompts, but it still will often default to trying to specify more than it needs to, instead of just getting out of the way and letting a lot of the really powerful functions in the Wolfram language um, make more sensible choices by default. Um, so talking about what's happening under the hood, Um, like I mentioned before, we've spent a lot of time over the last year building tools to allow LLMs to call Wolfram Alpha, use Wolfram language, learn about using Wolfram language more effectively, and give users better results. So we have a Wolfram Alpha API for LLMs. And people certainly get confused about this sometimes and think that that means we have an API that is backed by an LLM and it's doing something, but it is in fact an API where it's really just that the format has been styled um, to be consumed more easily by LLMs. So, for an example, we take the input from before about solar eclipses, and this is just a view of what the actual Wolfram Alpha API output is. It's essentially the full Wolfram Alpha results, all of the different pods, but rendered in just a kind of a plain text form. Tables in kind of a markdown view. Um, any place where there are interesting images, those are provided as links so that the LLM can pull in and show those. And generally, most of these systems are using markdown syntax to be able to show images. So it's got a reference to a URL where there's an image that it can pull up and show. Um, this also includes other features of Wolfram Alpha, so like assumings, which uh, also comes with instructions to the LLM. Hey, if you wanted to use a different assumption for this, you can send another API call and include this parameter. If you want to share the full website result, we've got links back to Wolfram Alpha. Um, and so those kinds of things are always going to be available in the results that are coming from Wolfram Alpha. On the Wolfram language side, what we learned very early on was, trying to prompt in the core prompt that you're providing to any LLM, all of the kind of tips and tricks and advice about common programming mistakes that people make um, for writing Wolfram language code or any code really is kind of impossible. There aren't enough tokens to do that. So what we started doing was knowing that ChatGPT or other LLMs, if they're evaluating Wolfram language code, this is going to be going through an API call to a Wolfram Cloud API. We've built a custom API that doesn't just evaluate code, doesn't just return the kind of error messages or messages that you would get in a notebook as a user. It also responds with suggestions tailored to LLMs to say, this is something that was wrong with your code. You should try this instead. And so keeping those kinds of suggestions very close to each particular call has meant that we see a lot of quick improvement. An LLM writes some Wolfram language code, it tries to evaluate it. There's an error, but it's getting useful information back from the API that says, this was what was wrong, try this thing instead. So just for example, these are sample outputs of the API. For the something fairly simple here. This is valid code. It produces a result, and we just send back a link to a rasterized image of that output in the cloud. Um, so again, sorry. So this is valid code sent to the Wolfram Language API. What we send back is there's an output. Here's a link to an image. It's a rasterized image of the result. Same code, but with an invalid option. The API is saying, okay, this is not a valid option for this. Um, if you were trying to find some particular option, you can evaluate this code. You could send this through the API, and you're going to get a list of valid options. Um, other things down to the ChatGPT will, if, without some changes that we've been making in the core GPT prompts, will often invent entity standard names and property standard names and entity types. So if it was sending something like this, entity building uh, a made up standard name height, it's going to get a result back that says this is not a valid entity. But if you want to find, maybe that's the name of something, you want to find a valid entity, you can try this interpreter call. Um, so there's a lot of things that we're doing in the Wolfram Language API to try to just make the experience of writing Wolfram language code through ChatGPT, through the Wolfram GPT, just more productive. So a lot of things where we're giving useful tips, useful information on top of the other things that we're doing actually in the prompt. Um, one second, I'm sorry. There are also one of the things that we've added on to the Wolfram GPT is so not just the basic Wolfram Alpha API, not just the Wolfram Language API, but also some additional utility functions. Um, so for things like the case that I just showed, where you might be want to write some Wolfram language code and you want to have access to things in the knowledge base. You're working with, let's say, buildings, and I'm saying here use Wolfram language to find the 5 tallest buildings in New York, compare them in a bar chart. Um, Makes 3 separate calls. I ask it about those a little bit further down, but it ends up makes a bar chart. It's retrieved the data in the language. It hasn't had any errors here. It shows the values. It's able to give you the information there. But now I'm saying, please explain that process. And so what it's doing, um, we have several additional utility APIs that we've hooked up for the Wolfram GPT to do things, including for cases where the GPT might want to get access to the knowledge base. It's got some natural language query like this. It can just send that query, basically the same kind of thing you might send to Wolfram Alpha, but it gets back instead the Wolfram language, semantic representation of that data, and it's an implicit entity class of building. Um, you know, in the city of New York, take the largest by height, and then it can go and it's retrieving that data, getting those things back as an association, and then making the bar chart and just feeding in bar chart of values of that. And finally, it gets that image back. So this is something that we've seen make a big difference anytime that you're trying to do any kind of programming uh, through the Wolfram GPT, using the Wolfram language, using any of the built-in knowledge, socioeconomic, demographic data, geographic, chemistry, biological species data, any of those things, we've seen a big improvement in performance for the GPT where it's able to form the right entity value calls, find the right properties, actually identify the data that's available and then incorporate it into Wolfram language code. Um, Other things to know about the GPT, if you've used ChatGPT Plus and used any of its own code writing abilities, then you would have noticed that you can upload files directly um, through the GPT interface. Um, you're not currently able to send files to the Wolfram GPT this way. But one thing that the Wolfram GPT can do that the built-in code functionality in ChatGPT can't do is directly go out and import files from the web. So, for example, something like this, this is just a CSV of data from the USDA, and I can say, please help me analyze this. It sends a call to the Wolfram Cloud, just importing that data set, takes a look at it, gives a summary. You can ask it to go through and show you a few rows. You can ask it to pull some specific data out, and it can just keep getting the data and writing Wolfram language code that's going to do whatever kind of analysis that you want. Um, so it's a great way, if you've got data that's outside of the knowledge base, you've got other things you want to bring in, this is how you want to try to access it using the Wolfram GPT. There are other things that we've also done. If you're familiar with the Wolfram function repository, it's a a very large and growing collection of Wolfram contributed and user contributed additional functions for the Wolfram language. And the Wolfram GPT can access those. There are some cases that we've already built into the prompt, actually, because there are some areas like food nutrition data, where if you're familiar with that in the Wolfram language, it's very powerful but can be very complex to write um, some of the queries. And so there's a resource function that is just a nutrition report that we've coached the GPT whenever you get a query that involves getting nutritional information. Instead of trying to write bespoke Wolfram language code, use this resource function. And it does a great job. Take some list of ingredients, it calls a resource function, um, and it pulls all that data in. And here I just asked to explain the process, and so it's tells you it's using this resource function. It's designed to do this. It takes inputs in natural language, so it doesn't have to try to interpret these things as canonical Wolfram language objects, um, and then gets a useful result. Um, we have a version in that's being tested right now that also um, builds on that a little bit and has some additional endpoints um, that allow the GPT to query documentation and get detailed usage information for resource functions. So this was kind of a chat that I had where I was playing around with asking the Wolfram GPT to give me information on sunspots and fetch solar images, and it was able to search documentation and figure out, okay, there's a space weather resource function, there's a solar image resource function. Look up the documentation for both of those things, be able to find the day with the highest sunspot activity, and then find an image of the sun on that date, which was kind of cool. Like, so a lot of cases where there's data that sorry, where there's data or functionality that you want to have available through the GPT, but it's not built into the language. Going the route of making use of things that are already in the function repository, or even contributing your own resource functions, um, is a great way to just really make it even more powerful. Um, I think that is most of what I wanted to cover about basic functionality. I will share, and again, borrowing this from my colleague Michael Trott, who has done a lot of work, and I think we have some links to other talks that he's done on prompting for LLMs and working with the Wolfram plugin and GPT. Um, like I said, we've tried in our prompting to encourage a chain of thought approach and try to get the Wolfram GPT to explain what it's going to do before it does it. But also, like I said, small variations in how you phrase a question, how much information you put in can have a big impact on that. So if you really want to see well documented Wolfram language code, it's good to express that. Um, it's good to, if you know you're going to be doing something that is fairly complicated, or you want help with building up a fairly complex chunk of code, something like don't write all the code together, but do each step separately and check. Um, just encouraging sort of basic debugging, incremental development kinds of approaches is really helpful. And I think you'll find that sometimes you'll ask a question, the GPT will try to write an entire function first time, many lines, many different subparts. Something goes wrong. And the best thing to do in that case is say, stop, take it apart, try evaluating each part, because then it's going to get useful information on what went wrong at each stage of the process, and you'll end up with a working useful function. um, Depending on your own personal preference and your level of familiarity with the Wolfram language, or even in interacting with things that are on Wolfram Alpha, um, ask for more information. Ask for, when you have results from Wolfram Alpha, you can ask it to go a little deeper into all of the additional contextual pods that came back. Um, you can ask it to explain code, reformat code, use different kinds of paradigms for variable names, um, you know, lots of things. We've tried to make the experience as smooth as we can with as concise a core prompt as possible. but certainly people are at different levels and have different needs, and definitely just play around with trying to get the best results for your particular purpose. Um, I think that is most of what I wanted to cover about the GPT.